We're going to start by doing J.D. Vance's takedown of the New York Times. And this is pretty interesting. Honestly, this weekend it wasn't even just the New York Times. It was also Martha Raddatz of ABC News. This clip went kind of viral. If you missed it, it's pretty fantastic. Here they are talking about whether Venezuelan gangs are taking over apartment complexes inside the United States.
The incidents were limited to a handful of apartment complexes, and the mayor said our dedicated police officers have acted on those concerns. A handful of problems.
Only, Martha, do you hear yourself? Only a handful of apartment complexes in America were taken over by Venezuelan gangs, and Donald Trump is the problem and not Kamala Harris's open border? Americans are so fed up with what's going on, and they have every right to be. And I really find this exchange, Martha, sort of interesting because you seem to be more focused with nitpicking everything that Donald Trump has said rather than acknowledging that apartment complexes in the United States of America are being taken over by violent gangs. I worry so much more about that problem than anything else here. We've got to get American communities in a safe space again. And unfortunately, when you let people in by the millions, most of whom are unvetted, most of whom you don't know who they really are, you're going to have problems like this. Kamala Harris, 94 executive orders that undid Donald Trump's successful border policies. We knew this stuff would happen. They bragged about opening the border, and now we have the consequences, and we're living with it.
What's really stunning about that clip, I mean, and J.D. Vance's response is fantastic. Do you even hear yourself? Is how earnest Martha Raddatz is. Like, this is a good point. It's only a handful of apartment complexes. She's really convinced she's got him on this one. And of course, she doesn't. And this has been something that has been replayed over and over and over again and has occurred many, many times since J.D. Vance became the vice presidential candidate. Another one that didn't get as much attention, though I wish it would, was this particular interview. It's from the podcast called The Interview, a conversation with J.D. Vance from the New York Times. And if you remember some of the Tim Walz interviews where he would just sit there and everyone would say, hey, don't you like hunting? Don't you like fishing? How did you get to be so nice? Or weren't you a good football coach? Like all these kiss-ass questions over and over and over again happened with Tim Walz. And, when he was introduced, J.D. Vance went immediately into he's weird and evil. Like that was immediately where it went. And it hasn't stopped since. I kid you not, I listened to this entire interview. It's over an hour long. But it was adversarial at every moment. Maybe with that one moment there's a slight exception to that. Maybe I'll give you that in a second. But it was adversarial. Hey, what's wrong with you? Why are you lying? Why are you doing these things wrong? Why is Donald Trump so bad? How can you defend this policy? You think about what you're doing here is you're putting J.D. Vance, your vice presidential candidate, in the most harsh room possible over and over and over and over again. And over again, he's come out really with, a blue ribbon. He's been doing a great job here. It was really impressive. They started off talking about we wanted to know which J.D. Vance would even show up here, like the nice one from the debate or the mean one, which was really at the core of his soul. It's just I want to take a moment and I don't know, note for history what we're seeing here. J.D. Vance has done more adversarial interviews in this campaign than the last 10 candidates on both parties combined. He is every single weekend, every other day, going in to another place where people are going to question him with hostile motives and dismantling them over and over and over and over again. When's the last time we've seen anything like this? I honestly don't know if it's ever happened. Maybe it has. I mean, back in the day, there weren't as many shows to go on, so it's hard to compare those eras. Even though back in the day, at least people would go on shows where they thought they might get a little bit of pushback. There's no example of it in recent memory. There's really nothing. And it is something we should notice, and it's pretty impressive. He is, J.D. Vance, after what you could call a rough rollout where people were criticizing him and saying it was not a good pick and it didn't seem to help Donald Trump in the polls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As we noted at the time, this is a pick that was made when Joe Biden was still in the race. And I would say it was, in a way, a luxury pick. And I say that because it was one of those picks where I think it wasn't necessarily to help a particular state. It wasn't like, we need to win Ohio. He's going to win Ohio anyway. It was more about how does Trumpism go forward after Trump? Who's the person we can hand this to and who has an intellectual basis for the types of policies that Donald Trump wants and that can bring this into the future effectively? Not to mention, obviously, the basic stuff that you want in a vice presidential candidate, someone who can go on TV and be the bulldog and all those things. Well, he's clearly helping the campaign. It has worked really, really well. And if you kind of see his vibe, which you notice probably, a lot of people noticed for the first time during the VP debate, but you definitely could pick it up there. It's very relaxed. It's very cordial. It's very friendly. It is pressing, but not mean or angry in any way. And that was really on display in this New York Times interview. He's, his arms up on the chair. He's looking at this and he's saying, this doesn't really affect me. I can take these questions and answer them honestly and get these points across very easily. Let me give you a couple examples. Let me give you the example of the most friendly moment in this interview. Over an hour, it was a question about J.D. Vance and his conversion to Catholicism. Listen to this exchange.
In 2019, you converted to Catholicism.
Yeah.
I'm a fellow Catholic. I find this
Great.
very interesting. And I would love for you to describe what appealed to you about the Catholic faith.
Yeah, so before I answer that question, I just offer a caveat out there. So what I really hate, and I've seen this with some converts, is they come into the faith, they act like they know everything, they speak for all Catholics. I'm never going to do that. I never want to do that. Look, I mean, I think there were a couple of things that really appealed about it to me. I mean, first of all, generally Christianity. I was thinking about the big questions, thinking about 2019, but 2017 to 2019, when I was thinking about re-engaging with my faith, I became a father during that period. I was very successful professionally. And so thinking about the working class family that I'd grown up in, I had a lot more money than I ever thought I would have. I had my own venture capital firm. And there was this weird way where I felt like I had succeeded at climbing the ladder of meritocracy, but I'd also found the values of the meritocracy, frankly, deeply wanting and deeply lacking. And when I started thinking about like the big things, like what do I actually care about in my life? Right? I really want to be a good husband. I really want to be a good father. I really want to be sort of a good member of the community. I wanted to be a virtuous human being, in other words. That was sort of the thing that I kept on coming back to, was how to be virtuous. And I thought the Christianity that I had discarded as a young man answered the questions about being a virtuous person better than the logic of the American meritocracy. And then, that sort of led me on a journey of, okay, well, I'm going to be a Christian. Again, what church do I actually want to raise my children in? What church do I want to be a participant of? And I just kept coming back for very personal reasons. Friends of mine who I thought, were just good people. Not all of them, but a lot of them were Catholics. And I talked to them about their faith and about what appealed to them about their faith. And that eventually led me to getting baptized in 2019. And
so I give you that exchange. I mean, he tells a good story, and it goes on about his relationship. I mean, it was a lengthy questioning about his Catholicism. And the reason why I think it was interesting was, of course, it wasn't actually a friendly exchange. It wasn't the non-adversarial part. It was a setup for another question, is basically like, if you're Catholic, why are you so bad? Was essentially the questioning that went on after that. Here's all the bad things that you've said, and here's all the bad things that you've done. That doesn't equate with Catholicism. But if you notice the posture, and if you happen to be listening on podcasts, you can hear it but not see it. But if you see the posture, she's, arms crossed, sitting back. There's not even the friendly nods that you'd give when someone's telling a personal story. Yeah, of course, yeah. None of that's going on. She's just deadpan, like a serial killer, staring at him like she's just waiting to go in for the murder. He's laid back. He's got his arm up on the side of the chair. He's like, whatever. I know what's going on here, and I'm not going to have a problem handling it. And it went on. They keep going back to these things with J.D. Vance, and they kept hitting him on these types of quotes that he had where he called Donald Trump bad names, and they have to do this. And he had a fascinating back and forth about a friend of his that was, is transgendered, and then flipped on him after he became famous. And we talked about it on the show. I think one of the most disgraceful things I've ever heard of. You have a friend for multiple years who then gets famous separate from you, and you don't like his politics, so you leak all your emails of your personal back and forth. But, she's coming after him with detailed notes and questions about his private messages from years and years and years ago. And he just tosses them to the side very easily while still remaining very positive and even saying, like, I'm still, in my mind, I'm still friends with her. Like, I think there was a breach of trust there, but, that's it. We had a great relationship, and I wish her the best. All that going on, and he able to just kind of move himself in, hit a point that he wants to hit, and move on to his next thing. Let me give you another one. We go into climate change. Now, of course, a lot of the stuff that they hit J.D. Vance on is stuff like, childless cat ladies. They brought that up 9 million times, of course, in this particular interview. And that goes kind of into somehow climate change conversation. But listen to, again, the way he actually explains this. It's a longer clip, but I think it's worth it. Listen.
Your position on those family values have gotten a lot of scrutiny lately.
Sure.
You've talked about childless cat ladies. You've called childless people sociopathic, psychotic, deranged. And I know that you've said that those comments were sarcastic, but it's hard to hear those words entirely as a joke. What do you actually think of childless women in society?
Well, as I said when I made those comments, and look, they were dumb comments. I certainly, I think most people probably who watch this have said something dumb, have said something that they wish they had put differently. And
you said it over in several different venues.
In a very, very short period of time. It was sort of a thing that I picked up on. I said it a couple of times in a couple of interviews. And look, yeah, I mean, I certainly wish that I had said it differently. I mean, what I was trying to get at is that, look, I'm not talking about people who it just didn't work out, right? For medical reasons, for social reasons, like set that to the side. We're not talking about folks like that. What I was definitely trying to illustrate in, ultimately a very inarticulate way is that I do think that our country has become almost pathologically anti-child. I put this in a couple of different ways, right? So there's one, it was actually when I was in law school. I was on a train between New York and New Haven. I think I was doing like law firm interviews or something. And obviously I didn't have kids then. And there's this young girl gets on the train. She's probably 21 or 22. She's, young black female, clear, like, tell by the way she was dressed. She didn't have a whole lot of money. She had a couple of kids with her. And, I remember like just watching her and thinking like, this is a really unbelievably patient mother. I mean, for being literally younger than I was, the reason I sort of noticed her is because her kids, like a lot of kids that age, are complete disasters, especially on public transportation. They turn it up to 11, but she was being so patient. But then like everybody around her was also noticing the kids being misbehaved, and they were so angry. And, they were and sighing and staring every time her 2-year-old made a noise. And that was sort of a moment that kind of stuck with me. And then, of course, I've had similar experiences riding with my own kids on various modes of public transportation. And again, it just sort of hit me like, okay, this is really, really bad. This thing that we do where we make motherhood or fatherhood, or there's this, again, I do think that there's like this pathological frustration with children that just is a new thing in American society. I think it's very dark. I think you see it sometimes in the political conversation, people saying, well, maybe we shouldn't have kids because of climate change. When I've used this word sociopathic, like that, I think is a very deranged idea. The idea that you shouldn't have a family because of concerns over climate change doesn't mean you can't worry about climate change.
I mean, that's a really good answer, and also paints a picture for people. Like, I don't know about you, but when I heard that, I pictured that train, and I pictured that mom sitting there with the train, with the kids out of control, and everyone around me. I mean, everyone's been in a situation where you saw something like that, and he's able to tell a story like that to illustrate a really important point that we have changed in our ideal of what American life is. Right? Instead of embracing the ideas of family, we are now rejecting them, and we're constantly degrading them. And he mentioned this thing, which I think is important, where you have a lot of people. We talked to Michael Schellenberger about this before, something that he's noticed, where people have anxiety over the climate, that they don't want to live their lives, they don't want to be productive, they don't want to have children because of climate change. And he mentions that idea that it's deranged and sociopathic, and it is. And she, of course, has to call him out on that as if it's controversial.
I just want to clarify something. So women who don't have children because they're worried about climate change, that's sociopathic?
Yes.
I think that is a bizarre way of thinking about the future.
Yes.
Not to have kids because of concerns over climate change. I think the more bizarre thing is our leadership who encourages young women and frankly young men to think about it that way. I mean, bringing life into the world has totally transformed the way that I think about myself, the way that I think about my wife, the way that I think, you watch your grandparents interact with grandchildren. It is like a transformatively positive and good thing for there to be children in the world. And if your political philosophy is saying, don't do that because of concerns over climate change, yeah, I think that's a really, really crazy way to think about the world.
I mean, we don't know why Kamala Harris did not have children, but
what does that have
do you
to,
include
that's not...
Kamala Harris in the category of women that you're talking about?
No, I mean, look, it was everything I know about Kamala Harris is that I've learned about Kamala Harris is that she's got a step family, she's got an extended family, she's a very good stepmother to her stepchildren. I would never accuse Kamala Harris along these lines. What I would say is that sometimes Kamala Harris, she hasn't quite jumped over the you shouldn't have kids because of climate change. But I think in some of her interviews, she's suggested there's a reasonableness to that perspective that, again, I don't think that's a reasonable perspective. I think that if your political ideas motivate you to not have children, then that is a bizarre way of looking at the world.
Yeah, it certainly is, by the way. I mean, he was much more restrained than I would be. Do you think it's sociopathic to not have kids because of climate change? Yes, it's sociopathic. Of course it is. It's completely insane to not make major life decisions because of 0.9 degrees Celsius over a century. That is absolutely sociopathic. If that's not in the dictionary next to the word sociopathic, it should be. But he handles it much, much better than I would, which is why he's the candidate, I suppose, and I'm not. This was, and I don't even play a lot of the stuff where he's being critical of Kamala Harris, but this was like an hour-long masterclass at how to handle the media in a difficult situation and how to pursue the messaging of your campaign at the same time. It was really, really good. And, I think the strategy right now of the campaign is really, really smart. You have a situation where Donald Trump goes into that interview and does it with the New York Times. I don't know what you get out of that, right? Like Donald Trump that's not his scene. He doesn't want to be in that scene. He doesn't want to sit there and talk about that stuff. He wants to go in there and be himself. And what they're doing is allowing Donald Trump to be himself. He's out there doing interviews like with Andrew Schultz and with all the big podcasts out there with massive audiences where he talks about the stuff that he cares about. And he's able to be likable and funny in those moments and people are laughing at his jokes. And it's the right way to present Donald Trump. On the other side, you have J.D. Vance, who's going into every adversarial position possible and dismantling, the media in a way that, I don't think we've seen a candidate do in my memory. He's been doing this every single week with real consistency, and it's something we should freaking notice. I will say this, it's interesting, and maybe this is an overstatement, but I do think it's like one of the most genuinely amazing things we've seen in politics in a really long time. He has basically rewritten the book as to how to be a vice presidential candidate. Never do you have this much reliance on a VP candidate. You certainly see this with Walz, who has done maybe 2 adversarial interviews with Fox News, and that's about it. He's been on maybe 50, 60, 70, 80 shows doing this every single day. It's something we haven't really seen before. And it's something for future vice presidential candidates to shoot for, and honestly for future presidential candidates to shoot for. Being able to do this is something really impressive. And I will look at J.D. Vance and say, he's a little bit more like on the populist strain of conservatism than I am. He's a little bit more maybe the nationalist strain of conservatism as I am. He is a guy who I would have some policy disagreements with, though, still I'm sure 80% of stuff I'd align with him on. The point of this, though, is it's very similar, and this comes off now because we know of this person to sound like an insult, but it really isn't. Take yourself back to 2012 for a second. You're back in 2012. You're coming off the Bush administration. The Bush administration has some good points, but generally speaking, had a lot of letdowns as well. And one of the real frustrations from conservatives in that period was like, can this guy just explain this stuff? He sounds like he's not confident in it. He sounds like he's constantly trying to cover himself. He's trying to like almost embarrassed about being a conservative, if he is one at all. We need someone who can actually communicate these things, to go into mainstream media, adversarial environments, and speak the conservative gospel. And then 2012 came, and Mitt Romney wound up being the nominee. He wasn't everybody's favorite, but he wound up being the nominee. And at that point, he was at the peak of what he might, as conservative as he ever sounded. Obviously, he's looking for a nomination. And this was the hope of what we could potentially get out of Mitt Romney. We might not agree with him on everything, but the hope was, here's a guy who can speak intelligently and go on in these adversarial situations and speak clearly and outline basics about conservatism in a way that's actually palatable to the average person, who can push back against mainstream media narratives successfully, dismantle them, and continue, not be embarrassed about it and not fall down all the time. Well, we didn't get that out of Mitt Romney, obviously. We're getting that out of J.D. Vance. He's what we may have wanted in 2012 out of a candidate when Mitt Romney became the nominee. We're getting out of J.D. Vance on a day-to-day basis. And look, he's obviously number 2 on the ticket. That's quite clear. Donald Trump is doing what Donald Trump does. He's quite a unique force. But J.D. Vance, no matter what happens in this election, and it's very, very close, but no matter what happens in this election, J.D. Vance has set himself up quite nicely for the next 4 years and maybe 8 years. He is going to go into this, whether you agree with everything he says or not, as the leader into the clubhouse as to who's going to be the next nominee most likely, because of the way he's handled himself. Again, he's gone out there with an impossibly difficult task, a task that no other candidate has even tried to take on. Nobody's done this. And he's done it over and over and over again with incredible amounts of success. I encourage you to go listen to that entire hour of the New York Times interview podcast with him. We didn't get to a lot of it, obviously, but it's worth listening to the entire hour because it is really, really impressive. And this is kind of just like a J.D. Vance appreciation thread, if you will, on national television. But I think it's deserved, and I think we shouldn't let this moment go by without noticing it.